Michael Carter never imagined that growing food would turn him into a prisoner in his own home. It all started when he lost his corporate job in finance, a company restructuring decision that left him staring at a severance package that wouldn't last beyond a few months. At first, he tried to cut expenses where he could, but with grocery prices skyrocketing, he realized that feeding himself and his teenage daughter, Olivia, was becoming an impossible challenge. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table staring at a $300 grocery bill, his eyes drifted outside to his wide, sunlit driveway. It was nothing more than empty pavement, a useless stretch of space doing nothing to help his situation. That was when an idea struck him. If he couldn't afford to buy food, why not grow it? Without hesitation, he drove to the local garden center and spent what little money he had left on plastic planters, soil, and vegetable seedlings. His driveway, which got 6 hours of sunlight daily, was perfect for a small-scale garden. Within a week, neat rows of containers lined the edges of his driveway, sprouting tomatoes, bell peppers, zucchini, and herbs. To Michael, this was more than a hobby, it was survival. His first small harvest saved him nearly $70 on groceries, and Olivia even helped him water the plants every morning before school. Neighbors started to take notice. Mr. Hernandez, an elderly widower from 2 houses down, approached one afternoon with a warm smile. "That's a smart move, son," he said, handing over some unused tomato cages from his old garden. Mrs. Patel, who lived on the corner lot, stopped by one morning to compliment the setup. Even kids from the neighborhood started asking questions about the plants, fascinated by the idea of growing food instead of just buying it from a store. Everything seemed to be going well, until the click of a camera lens shattered Michael's peace. One afternoon, he spotted Patricia Langley, the president of the HOA, standing on her pristine, manicured lawn, snapping photos of his driveway farm with her iPhone held at an accusatory angle. When Michael waved at her, she didn't return the greeting. Instead, she turned sharply and disappeared into her house. Later that evening, an email landed in Michael's inbox from the HOA board, subject line, "Violation of Community Standards." The message, written in the cold and formal language of bureaucracy, stated that his vegetable planters violated HOA Code 13B, which required all driveways to remain clear of long-term obstructions. It demanded that he remove the unsightly agricultural setup within 7 days, or face a $100 per day fine. Michael was stunned. Nothing in the HOA handbook specifically prohibited vegetable gardens. The rule they cited only mentioned long-term storage, not actively growing plants. Hoping to resolve the issue, he printed out copies of the HOA rules and went to speak with Richard Alden, the vice president of the board. Richard, a stoic middle-aged man in a crisp polo shirt, listened with an impassive expression as Michael explained his case. "The board interprets the rules, not the homeowners," Richard said flatly, before shutting the door in Michael's face. Over the next 3 days, Michael received 2 more warning letters. Then a formal violation notice was taped to his door, threatening legal action if he refused to comply. Patricia wasn't done yet. On Monday morning, Michael woke up to find his planters had been knocked over, soil and young plants scattered across the pavement. His security camera footage revealed the culprits, Patricia's teenage son and 2 of his friends, laughing as they kicked over the containers. Furious, Michael called the local police, but Officer Reed, the responding officer, simply sighed. "HOA disputes are civil matters," he said. "There's not much we can do unless it's clear-cut vandalism." Michael was left to clean up the mess himself, feeling both angry and helpless. Then came the anonymous letter. It was stuffed into his mailbox, written in the same elegant cursive handwriting Patricia had used on the HOA's Christmas cards last year. "Gardens belong in the backyard, not where everyone has to see them. Do the right thing before this gets worse." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about rules, this was personal. As if to prove that point, the HOA suddenly started targeting his neighbors who had supported him. Mrs. Patel received a fine for a bird feeder she had for 5 years. Mr. Hernandez was cited for having a decorative gnome in his front yard. Even Dave, the firefighter down the street, got a violation notice for his kid's basketball hoop. The pattern was obvious. Anyone who sided with Michael was being punished. This wasn't about community standards, it was about control. Determined to fight back, Michael spent nights poring over county regulations. After hours of research, he stumbled upon a critical detail. His subdivision had no specific rules banning driveway gardens, and there were legal protections for personal food cultivation in his county. He drafted a formal response letter and sent it to the HOA, citing county zoning laws and questioning the selective enforcement of HOA rules. But the HOA had already decided to escalate things further. Just 3 days later, as Michael stepped outside for his morning coffee, his jaw dropped at what he saw. Patricia had taken things to an entirely new level. Metal spike strips now lined both sides of his driveway, effectively trapping his car in place. If he tried to drive over them, his tires would be shredded instantly. A large red sign was posted next to his mailbox. Violation zone, restricted movement until compliance. Michael realized something terrifying. He was now a prisoner in his own home. Michael Carter stood frozen in his driveway, his morning coffee forgotten in his trembling hand. The sunlight reflected menacingly off the rows of jagged metal spikes installed along both edges of the pavement, trapping his only working vehicle like an animal in a cage. A bold red sign loomed beside his mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo, Violation Zone, Restricted Movement Until Compliance. His stomach twisted in disbelief. They hadn't just fined him, harassed him, and sabotaged his plants. Now they had physically imprisoned him on his own property. The sheer audacity of it made his blood boil. How far was the HOA willing to go to crush his driveway farm? He stormed toward the spike strips, examining them up close. Heavy-duty steel teeth protruded upward at sharp angles, designed to shred tires beyond repair. These weren't some cheap deterrents. They were the kind of tire-puncturing devices used by law enforcement to stop fleeing criminals. His hands clenched into fists. Except in this case, the so-called criminal was just a man growing food to survive. Michael whipped out his phone and called the police, his pulse hammering in his ears. It took over 30 minutes for an officer to arrive, time he spent pacing angrily, taking pictures and documenting every inch of the steel trap the HOA had installed. When Officer Greg Martinez finally pulled up in his patrol car, he stepped out, adjusting his utility belt with a skeptical frown. "You called about a spike strip problem?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Michael pointed at the obstructed driveway, his frustration bubbling over. "Not just a problem, officer. This is illegal detention. They've physically trapped me in my own home unless I remove my garden. This isn't a fine anymore. It's extortion." Martinez scratched the back of his head, eyeing the malicious contraption with a grimace. "I'll be honest, I've seen HOA disputes over fencing, paint colors, even Christmas lights, but never something like this." He jotted down notes while circling the spiked barricade, occasionally shaking his head. "Problem is, this still falls under a civil dispute unless I can prove a direct criminal intent to harm you." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're telling me they can just block me in like a prisoner, and it's not a crime?" Officer Martinez sighed. "It's highly unethical, possibly unlawful, but whether it constitutes false imprisonment is up to a judge." He looked back at his patrol car. "My best advice? Get a lawyer. This is a fight for the courts." Michael's hands shook with frustration, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. If the law wouldn't act, then he had to fight on his own terms. As Martinez drove off, Michael pulled out his phone and started filming, walking around the driveway explaining exactly what had happened. If the police wouldn't stop this, maybe the public would. He uploaded the video to his local community group, captioning it, "HOA blocked my driveway with spike strips. Is this legal?" He didn't expect much, just a handful of comments from sympathetic neighbors. But within an hour, his phone blew up with hundreds of notifications. The post had gone viral. People from across the neighborhood, and even from other communities plagued by HOAs, were outraged. "This is straight-up insanity," one person commented. "They trapped you in your own home? That's got to be illegal." Another user tagged local news stations, urging them to cover the story. That's when Michael realized this wasn't just his fight anymore. He had an entire angry community behind him. Fueled by that support, he dove into research like never before. He stayed up until 3 in the morning, poring over county zoning laws, HOA bylaws, and property rights regulations. He dug through legal case studies, government archives, and obscure homeowner protection acts, determined to find something, anything that could strike back at the HOA legally. Then, at exactly 3:42 a.m., buried deep within old county planning document, he found it. A single, powerful clause that changed everything. Michael sat up straight, his pulse hammering. The document, a dusty subdivision agreement from 1998, detailed the land's original development under the County Agricultural Heritage Act. It explicitly granted every homeowner in Maple Creek Estates the legal right to cultivate food on their property, including driveway planters. The wording was crystal clear: No governing body, homeowners association, or external entity shall infringe upon the agricultural rights of homeowners in this subdivision. Michael read it 3 more times just to make sure he wasn't imagining things. This wasn't just a loophole, it was a direct, legally binding protection. The HOA had no right to fine him, no right to demand he remove his crops, and certainly no right to install physical barriers on his driveway. For the first time since this nightmare began, Michael smiled. The HOA had made a fatal mistake. They had overplayed their hand, and now he was going to burn their entire case to the ground. But first, he needed reinforcements. The next morning, he called every lawyer in town until he found the one person willing to take the fight head-on, a sharp, fearless property rights attorney named Sarah Whitman, known for tearing corrupt HOAs apart in court. "You've got the HOA dead to rights," Sarah said, after reviewing the subdivision documents. "Their entire case collapses under this law. And these spike strips," she scoffed. "That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Michael felt something shift inside him, a newfound confidence. The HOA had bullied him, humiliated him, vandalized his property, and tried to force him into submission. But now he had the law on his side. Sarah immediately filed an emergency motion, demanding the removal of the spike strips and severe penalties for HOA overreach. Within hours, a judge scheduled a hearing. Word spread like wildfire. Local news stations showed up, filming Michael's driveway, interviewing outraged residents, and exposing the HOA's abuse of power to the public. Even other HOA-controlled neighborhoods started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories. That evening, as Michael stood on his porch watching news vans parked in front of his house, he saw Patricia Langley and Richard Alden standing in the shadows across the street. For the first time, they didn't look smug. They looked nervous, because they knew they were about to lose everything. The courtroom was packed. Every bench, every available seat, even the back wall was lined with people, neighbors from Maple Creek Estates, residents from other HOA-controlled communities, and reporters from at least 3 different news stations, all here for one reason: to see if an HOA could get away with imprisoning a man for growing food. Michael Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer, Sarah Whitman, flipping through the case files with the ease of someone who had already won before the trial even began. Across from them, Patricia Langley and Richard Alden sat stiffly beside their lawyer, David Kramer, a sleek corporate type in a navy blue suit who looked more annoyed than concerned. Judge Eleanor Watkins, a stern woman in her early 60s, took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and went straight for the throat. "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "And before we begin, I would like to ask the defendants," she paused, looking directly at Richard and Patricia, "what on earth possessed you to think you had the authority to install police-grade spike strips around someone's property?" Patricia opened her mouth, probably to spin a rehearsed speech about property values. But Richard, sensing the judge's patience was already thin as glass, cut in quickly. "Your Honor, the spike strips were merely a violation of multiple state and federal property rights laws." Judge Watkins interrupted, arching an eyebrow. "I read the HOA's charter. I read the subdivision's original development agreement, and I read the County Agricultural Heritage Act of 1998, which, if I may remind you, overrides all HOA policies. You knew full well that Mr. Carter's driveway farm was protected by law, and you still attempted to bully him into compliance." The room exploded with murmurs. Michael's hands clenched under the table. This was it. Sarah stood up, her voice steady and controlled. "Your Honor, not only did the HOA illegally detain my client by blocking his ability to leave his home, but they also engaged in a pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and property destruction." She motioned toward the courtroom screens, where the security footage played, Patricia's son and his friends destroying Michael's planters. The audience gasped. Then came the footage of Patricia's husband, Tom, creeping onto Michael's property in the middle of the night, slashing irrigation lines, tearing out plants, dumping what appeared to be bleach over fresh soil. The police report from Officer Martinez confirmed it. But the final blow came when Sarah pulled out the HOA's internal emails, obtained through a public records request. "These messages," she said, holding up printed copies, "show Patricia Langley and Richard Alden intentionally conspiring to target Mr. Carter, not because of any real violation, but because of a personal vendetta." One of the emails was displayed on the courtroom monitor. From Patricia Langley to Richard Alden. Subject: "That eyesore of a driveway. We need to find a way to force Carter out of the neighborhood." If we can't find him into compliance, we should make life as difficult as possible. If that means creative enforcement, then so be it. The murmurs turned into outright gasps. A reporter in the audience typed furiously on his phone. Judge Watkins leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. Her expression was sheer disappointment. Mr. Kramer, she addressed the HOA's lawyer. Do you still wish to contest this case? Kramer's face was ashen. He turned to Richard, then Patricia, both of whom looked shell-shocked, like rabbits cornered by a wolf. He adjusted his tie. Your Honor, we would like to settle. Michael felt something inside him shift, a sense of victory finally within reach. But Sarah wasn't done yet. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said smoothly, we're not just here for a settlement. We are here for justice. My client was harassed, falsely imprisoned, and had his property sabotaged. We are requesting the immediate removal of the spike strips, a court order preventing further interference with his driveway farm, compensation for damages, and she paused, her eyes narrowing on Richard and Patricia, a complete re-election of the HOA board. The courtroom erupted. Richard shot to his feet. You can't just. Sit down, Mr. Alden. Judge Watkins' gavel slammed against the wood. Silence. The judge's gaze swept the room. This court finds the Maple Creek Estates HOA guilty of unlawful detainment, harassment, and selective enforcement. The HOA will pay $175,000 in damages to Mr. Carter, covering all fines, legal fees, and property destruction costs. Michael's heart leaped into his throat. The spike strips are to be removed immediately. Furthermore, the HOA board is hereby dissolved, and a new election will be held within 30 days, under the supervision of a court-appointed observer. Patricia looked like she was about to faint. Richard had gone ghost white. Kramer sighed and sat back down, rubbing his temples like a man who had just lost everything. Judge Watkins slammed the gavel one final time. Case closed. The moment the court adjourned, the room erupted into cheers. Michael barely had time to react before dozens of neighbors surrounded him, shaking his hand, congratulating him. He spotted Dave from 3 houses down, grinning ear to ear. You did it, man. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. Mr. Carter, how does it feel to stand up to the HOA? Michael smiled, looking straight into the camera. It feels like freedom. By the time Michael arrived home, a full-scale neighborhood rebellion was underway. Neighbors gathered outside, watching as a hired crew removed the spike strips under Officer Martinez's supervision. Several homeowners had printed signs, waving them at passing cars. HOA reform now. Let US grow. Power to the residents. Patricia and Richard, they were nowhere to be seen. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened. The community fought back against the HOA's old ways. The new board, made up of actual reasonable neighbors, voted to approve community gardens and eliminate pointless restrictions. Michael's driveway farm? Bigger than ever. And Patricia? She quietly sold her house and moved away, unable to face the neighborhood she once ruled. 3 months later, Michael received a letter from a state senator thanking him for bringing attention to the abuses of HOA power. His case had sparked legislative action. A new bill, the Homeowner Freedom Act, was being introduced to protect homeowners from overreaching HOAs statewide. As he stood in his driveway, watering his thriving tomato plants, he couldn't help but smile. They tried to take everything from him. Instead, they gave him something even more valuable, change. And it all started with a few seeds.